No. Okay, I'll go first. Okay, so let's see if
That's
I
what's
can
on my
share.
list.
Pardon?
You go first, then David is second. So-
Okay, okay. So I'm sharing screen. Let me go up here and get play. Okay, let me get back to the start. Okay, so yeah, give me I got probably 25, 30 minutes. So maybe a half hour, give me a nudge, Farouk. So I'll speed up. So flashpoint number 4. Okay, so Dave and I have done all these previous talks, and the first one was in 2021 when we identified the problem. Initially, I thought that the situation was that the Russians wanted to have buffer states, these buffer states. It may be a little worse than that, maybe a lot worse than that, because Putin in a recent conversation said his mission is like Peter the Great, to reclaim Slavic lands. Well, reclaiming Slavic lands that the Russians had before means the Baltic states, Poland, a bunch of other places. So, and that's annexation. That's not a buffer state. So we could be in for a little bit worse of a problem than I originally thought. Now, I was going to recommend this book last time and I forgot it. So I want to do it right up front. This book, of course, it's an opinion, but it does describe how Putin's people that were originally in St. Petersburg and all his other friends got into really key positions in all the companies and throughout the government of Russia. So, you always take it with a grain of salt. It's one person's opinion, but it is a really good book, in my opinion. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about is the general military situation, Donbass in particular, Western aid, NATO, and economic war. That wasn't part of what I wrote before, but that seems to be heating up. Okay, so the general military situation in Kharkiv, the Russians were pushed back nearly to the border in some places, but now they're pushing back a little bit because they want to keep the Ukrainians out of artillery range of Belgorod. Belgorod and Kharkov are on two sides of the border, about equally spaced. So the Russians have been shelling Kharkov since the beginning for 3 months, and they're afraid that the Ukrainians would do the same to Belgorod, but I don't think they will. Mariupol, that was surrounded for 80 days, and the Ukrainians surrendered 2,500 soldiers, or maybe 500 of those are civilians, but it was a big surrender. But they held out for a long time. They had no aid whatsoever. The land bridge on the west side of Dnieper, the Ukrainians are making small advances over there. Donbass, this is really probably the big area where things are going on. The advances are not dramatic, but they're small and steady. The Russians are using World War I techniques of just pulverizing the area and then moving forward a half a mile or a mile. Naval situation, no major conflict. The blockade continues. The one thing is that the Harpoon missiles have been delivered by Denmark to Ukraine. Russian losses are accumulating. Ukrainian losses obviously are accumulating too. Now, all I was able to get was this website, which you can see at the upper left if you're interested in looking at. This is Ukrainian, okay? It's minus, MINUS, RUS.com. So it's one source of what the Russian losses would be. Now, Oryx, which is another source, I haven't been able to get a good summary from them. So I don't know, maybe Dave's got a better handle on that. But this says that the losses are pretty big. So if you look, what it says, that the Russians came in with like 200,000 troops initially to invade Ukraine. That's not their whole armed forces, but it's 200,000 troops. And it says that 30,000 are dead, nearly 100,000 wounded. That's 129,000. That's 68% of the invasion force. Now, that's probably high. So that's why I would like the Oryx number, so you could sort of say, here's a high estimate, here's a low estimate, or a lower estimate, and maybe it's somewhere in between. But I think that the losses have been considerable, but they've been able to replenish them, but it's not easy. They are stretching out the age for eligibility for people to join the military and doing a bunch of other things to get troops to the front. They've also lost a lot of tanks and armored personnel carriers, but I think that's much less than it was in the first month or two. So this is month 3. So the plan after the Russians pulled out of around Kiev in the northern part of Ukraine was to take Luhansk and Donetsk on the left picture that shows the two regions there. Luhansk, they have probably 95% or more of that territory in hand. So once they get 100% of that, and I think they probably will get 100% of it, Putin's going to say, you know, hey, success, I got one province, I've just got the other one to go to. Okay, that's the other orange. But they've also got additional territory, which is that land bridge across the bottom. So if you look at the picture on the right, what they were talking about initially was to cut off all the Ukrainian troops in Donbass. That would be that arrow. They're not doing that. I mean, it doesn't say that they couldn't do it in the future if they had pretty big reinforcements, but we don't see those right now. So what it's amounting to is small half-mile advances on a daily basis, not a big maneuver like this. Mariupol, that was cut off for 80 days. They just surrounded it. There was no resupply. None of the wounded were able to be treated. And eventually, after 80 days of pretty gallant effort by the Ukrainians, they finally surrendered. So they got about 2,500 prisoners out of that. Now, Donbass, this is where the main action is happening. This is definitely, as opposed to the first 2 months, better fighting conditions for the Russians. So you got less forests, it's flat, there's no Rasputitsa, they've got short supply lines. They got a big artillery advantage. Remember, I showed last time that the attacking forces, the tanks and the armored personnel carriers, that's where the losses are. And in the artillery, not very many losses at all. Okay, so they've got a big, and they're always strong in artillery, they've got a big advantage over the Ukrainians in that. Now, in the area that they're fighting, no forest, flat land, but there are some rivers and water barriers, and that could be a problem. Well, it is a problem for the Russians, and it just depends how the fighting develops, what the path is. The Russians are concentrated on getting that last piece of Luhansk, and that's Severodonetsk is first, and then the city across the river, and I've got a map showing that. The Ukrainians are continuing to kill or wound top Russian generals. The Russian generals and the officers are being responsible for the advancement of the troops, and so they're going to the front. That's putting them up there in danger of getting killed, and they do get killed. So Ukrainian victory at a river crossing. I'm going to show you this. So in that last picture, I showed you that big arrow. The original talk was, hey, we're just going to come around behind the Ukrainian troops and capture them all in Donbass. That's just not happening. And one of the things is the Izium headquarters was attacked. I'll talk about that later. If you look way over to the right, you see Severodonetsk. Okay, that's in a little pocket there, and that's where most of the fighting is now. That's about the last little bit of Luhansk. Okay, so here's what it kind of looks like. So in the big picture, you don't see much advancement by the Russians, but if you look at it on a detailed basis, you see all those dashed lines, dashed red and white lines. That's where they've been advancing. So it's been in miles, okay, or half-mile increments. And you see that line up at the front, which is kind of crooked. That's all a river up there. And the Russians have had trouble crossing that river, okay? Got another picture of that. Okay, so if you can see that, it says Seversky Donetsk River. Okay, see that river? The Russians have not been able to cross that river. Okay, and it comes, Severodonetsk is on the east side of the river, Lysychansk is on the west side of the river. So will they be able to cross the river? Or you can see the river running into the Russian zone down here at the lower right. Will they just come up from the south? Okay, so that remains to be seen. But on the river, they're not doing well. So they tried to come across here. Let's see. Let me go back. See that city, Bilohorivka. They tried to cross there with a battalion tactical group. And the Ukrainians were waiting for them. They figured they would try to cross there. They let some of the troops come across, and they just unloaded on them with artillery. They were massed on both sides of the river, so it was a perfect artillery target. And the Ukrainians just launched probably Grad missiles, regular artillery, and they knocked out 80 vehicles and 500 men, probably pretty much destroyed a small battalion tactical group. They're usually about 800 people, but it was pretty well shattered. So it was definitely a Russian loss and a Ukrainian victory, and it's this river. So here I show a blow up of Severodonetsk on the right. The Ukrainians don't hold that much territory now. They've been pushed back, and they've been pushed back into this Azot chemical plant, which is a big chemical plant with World War, Soviet era bunkers, anti-atomic bomb bunkers underneath it. So they're fighting in that area. The Russians say they've cut off all the Ukrainians. They have knocked out all these bridges across the river, but I don't know it's quite like Mariupol. We'll have to see how it works out. But then when they come across here, if they want to get to Lysychansk, which is the last little bit of Luhansk, they're going to have to cross this river. And so far they have not done too well in crossing the river. So we'll have to see how long does it take them to take Severodonetsk. They probably will take it sooner or later, but if it takes them a month, that's not going to be too good. Okay, and in this area, this is just another picture. This is just a guy that comments up there, right? And I swiped his map, but you can kind of see the front line, and you can kind of see the water barriers that I'm talking about. So if you're the Ukrainians and you have the Russians advancing it, and you can use these water barriers, it makes your defense job a lot easier. Okay, so there was a Lacane type attack. I forget if I mentioned this last time, but I want to really describe what happened here. Lacane type attack on the Izium headquarters. So you see Izium up there in the kind of the center left of the picture, and the headquarters are there, and that was going to be the drive down to the bottom. And the guy that came out to make this drive happen was Gerasimov. He's the number 2 guy. He's the guy, the left guy in this picture at the right. So he's the chief of staff. Shogu is on the right. He's the head of the defense department. So he came out there, and it was pretty obvious to me, at least what my speculation was, is he's going to get the resources and he's going to drive down there. Well, the Ukrainians found out that he was at the headquarters and where the headquarters was. And when I say Lacane type attack, what they did in World War II was the Lacane type attack was by the British. And day 3 after D-Day, the Germans had amassed 3 armored divisions, and they were going to attack right between the British beaches and the American beaches, Omaha to the north and British beaches to the south. And they had 3 divisions in there, but it's tough territory. It's hilly. I've been in there. It's windy roads, and you really have to have great traffic control. You have to have great logistics. You really got to be able to handle your armored divisions right. So they brought out just a Panzer Group headquarters called Panzer Group West headquarters, and they were going to manage the attack of the 3 divisions, and then the divisions just execute the plan. Well, the British found out through SIGINT where the headquarters was. It was at a chateau called Lacane, and they acted on it within hours. They hit it with 500-pound bombs with fighter bombers, and then came over with light bombers right at dinner time. Okay, so they got them right at dinner time, wiped out the headquarters, killed most of the guys, wounded the top general, and the attack by the armored divisions never happened because they didn't have the officers to do it. It took them about 3 weeks to reconstitute the headquarters with qualified officers. By that time, the opportunity was gone, and Patton was getting ready to break out. So it was a pretty good coup by the Ukrainians to find out where the headquarters was and just unload, just like they did on the river crossing, unload with artillery. Okay, Western aid. The Ukrainians, of course, need a lot more Western aid. Some they've gotten in tanks. The Poles have given them 200 tanks, so half about what they've asked for. This is just one chart speculating what they got. In terms of the MRLS systems, hard, 50 out of 300, so they're way behind the Russians on that. They've used them, remember, in the Izium headquarters attack, so they know what to do if they got the weapons, but they don't have enough of these weapons. In artillery, they're way behind the Russians. They're asking for 1,000 howitzers. They got 250, but I think the Russians have got probably like 5,000, 10,000 of these weapons. So they're way behind the Russians on that. The one thing that big thing that the Ukrainians have is Harpoon missiles. This was given by Denmark, and this will definitely make any amphibious landing at Odessa pretty difficult. Okay, NATO. The big thing is, last time I said that the popular opinion in Sweden and Finland was to join NATO. Now they've formally applied. And this makes a very big difference strategically for the Baltics in particular, but for NATO in general. Before, with Sweden and Finland neutral, if you had to, there was an attack on the Baltics and NATO was going to supply aid up through Poland, they would go where that red arrow is, through the Suwalki Gap, and then you got to go a few hundred miles north to Estonia. That's pretty shaky, okay? So the Russians are probably going to get there first. But with Finland and Sweden in there, now it's pretty easy to resupply these guys right from across the ocean, pretty easy. This makes the Baltics far, far more secure. And strategically, it's pretty bad news for the Russians. Economic war. So this is what I want to talk about. I'm going to talk about energy prices. So Dave may have some information on this. So I welcome Dave's comments. I'm going to talk about a few things, things that haven't happened, but they're being talked about. So NATO, former chief of NATO, who is Rasmussen from Denmark, said we need an Article 5 on economic warfare. We have Article 5 if a NATO nation's invaded, then militarily all the rest of NATO responds. He says if there's economic intimidation of a country, we need to respond similarly, probably as a result of seeing what the sanctions are doing to Russia. But we'll have to see if that develops. Second thing on oil is, and maybe Dave's got a comment on this, is Yellen and some of the Europeans are saying, well, what we need is a buyer's cartel to limit the price that we're going to pay for Russian oil. I don't know if that's going to go anywhere, but at least they're talking about something like that. And then Europe moves to bar insurance on ships carrying Russian oil. Hasn't happened, but I think it's passed, and so we have to see if this is implemented, and if it's implemented, what's going to be the impact of that. That's going to make it harder for any ships anywhere in the world to go to a Russian port, pick up oil, and come out, because they won't be insured, at least by Europe, and who knows who will insure them. Okay, economic warfare, which I think is pretty significant here. 1,000 Western companies are out of Russia. I think the remaining companies are probably all French. But one of the companies that moved out was Siemens, and Siemens has had a relationship with Russia for 170 years. So this is a pretty big deal. This is a pretty big deal. Inflation, 17%. I think it will go higher. Chips, Western high tech has been banned from Russia, so they're getting shortages that ripple through their production of a lot of sophisticated equipment. And then a headline, I haven't seen much more on this, but it says Huawei is pulling out of Russia. Now I got to see, what this means, because I thought it would be a great opportunity for Huawei to just move in because the Western companies are pulling out. So I have to see if this really happens. But I think if they do get out of Russia, it's because they don't want any sanctions on them. So, got to keep, that was just a headline, got to see if that happens there. Now, maybe Dave will have some comments on this, but what I'm looking at is from the dollar's point of view and from the economic point of view for the Russians. How big are the Russian energy exports to the EU? And really it's in euros, but I don't have a euro sign, so I put dollars. So I'm trying to estimate this, and I'm trying to get the best information I got. And this chart shows that it's about averaging about 50 billion a month. Now that's from Eurostat, okay? So I look at another chart. This is Russian exports period, which is mostly energy. And it looks like this is through 2021, January 2022. It looks like about 45 billion. So 45, 50 billion looks like good numbers. So what happens when that starts going down? It's not going down yet, but maybe it is going down a little bit. So in the first 3 months of the war, again, another headline number. So you never know what the quality of these numbers are, but the FT reported that 93 billion was sent by Europe to Russia for energy. Now, if that's true, that's a lot of money, but it's also, if 50 billion a month is the average, then it's below average. So maybe there's already, even though what the Russians have less supplies coming to the West, but they're selling them at a higher price. But even though they're doing that, it looks like they're getting less money to me. It looks like this. So trying to get good numbers on this is really tough, but this is what I think. So I think that if we look out here to the end of the year, to the end of December 2022, the Europeans say we're going to phase out oil. That's going to be most of that $50 billion is oil. Now we got to see if they're really going to phase it out. And natural gas could be way down. They still want to get Russian natural gas at the end of the year, but it could be way down. So could the Russians be looking, instead of 50 billion a month, could they be looking at 10 billion a month? So 50 billion a month times 12 months is 600 billion, 110 billion a month. I'm just picking these numbers out, times 12 months, you know, that's more like 100 billion. Okay, so it'd be a real drop in their GDP. Now, in terms of Russian national gas, the Baltics pulled out. They didn't wait for the Russians to cut them out. They left Russian natural gas supplies. Poland and Bulgaria were kicked out because they weren't going to pay in rubles. Now, all the other countries, especially Germany, I've got these accounts, and maybe Dave can explain this, you know, where they pay in euros, but it gets converted to rubles. So they're still getting gas. But just here in the last day or two, the Russian natural gas to Germany via Nord Stream 1 has been cut by 60%. Now they're saying the reason for this is that they don't have the compressors, that the compressors are out for maintenance, and they're in Canada, and they haven't been coming back, and so therefore the Russians have to cut this gas. In my humble opinion, this is complete BS. Okay, because you've got Nord Stream 2 sitting there with compressors that are totally unused, and they could just bring those compressors right over to Nord Stream 1. So this is totally political by Putin, in my opinion. And I think he's doing it because at this point in time, he's still got the power of doing this. If he tries to do this 6 months from now, his supplies to Europe may be down to 10% of what they normally were. And if he threatens to cut off the last 10%, it's not going to have a lot of impact. Right now, the supplies are much higher. So I think he's doing it for that. He may be shooting himself in the foot, because when he cuts these supplies by 60%, he's cutting the revenue for that natural gas by 60% for Nord Stream 1. That more natural gas comes across than that. Okay, so now let me summarize. I just got 3 charts. I'm going as fast as I can. Donbass, better conditions for the Russians, big artillery advantage, steady advances. So what they're hoping to do is to continue that through the whole Donetsk Oblast and get that. And then when he gets those 2 provinces, he's going to say, hey, you know, ceasefire. Okay, West has given insufficient artillery. We gave a lot of anti-tank missiles, but we haven't given a lot of artillery, which is bigger. Okay, but we have given harpoons. So I think amphibious landing pretty much off the table for the Russians. Maybe they try it, but if they try it, I think there'd be huge losses. Maybe since the Danes have given them harpoons, the Norwegians can give them a Navy strike missile. Navy strike missile's got a 300-mile range. So you could sit in Odessa, fire one of these things and sink a ship in Sebastopol Harbor because it's 200 miles away. Okay, we've got the Russian recruit class. It was April or May that they got another 140,000 troops. These are new recruits. Now the recruits, you know, supposedly they've got a rule that you don't have to fight outside Russia. If you're a recruit, you be a contract employee, you can volunteer to do that. So I don't know how many of these people want to fight in Ukraine. We'd have to see that, or whether they'd be compelled to fight in Ukraine. And when are they ready to fight in Ukraine? This is something that we don't know at this point in time. But obviously, if they could do that and put 140,000 troops in tomorrow, it'd make a big difference. What we have not seen from the Western side is the effect of the kamikaze UAVs, mainly because we only gave them 100 because that's all we had in the inventory. Now, we gave them 20,000 anti-tank missiles, but we had those in inventory. We've got to ramp up production for the UAVs before they'll have thousands of UAVs. So how long is that going to take? Don't know. The 40 billion in aid, we haven't seen the impact of that. What I saw in the paper today is we have given them, up to this point in time, which is the first 3 months, we have actually given them 5 billion in military aid. So there's a lot of military aid there in that 40 billion that's yet to have an impact. We have to see what happens and how timely it's there. I still think that time is on the side of Ukraine. Now, things could change and it could turn around the other way, but I think Russia's looking at a manpower shortage with their existing troops. So maybe they could go to a general mobilization. Maybe they can get these 140,000 new troops up and trained and willing to fight or compelled to fight in Ukraine. So, but I think they do have a manpower problems. You see this, they're raising the age of who's eligible to fight, you know, from 40 to 49, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, Russia is looking at a loss, I think, of energy revenue. And I'm looking at the next 6 months, maybe dropping from like an average of 600 billion a year to 100 billion a year. These are just rough numbers, but that's a big, big decrease. And that's going to cause a lot of unemployment. Plus, they're going to have a lot less money to fight this war. They do have a reserve, $200 billion, but I think they're going through that. So I think that's why I say time is on the side, I think, of Ukraine. The NATO economies in general, if you add them up, $40 trillion, $1 trillion, maybe a little bit more for Russia, but certainly not even $2 trillion. With that kind of economic advantage, I think the West can send more weapons than the Russians can produce. So I think at the present time, particularly in the Donbass area, the Russians have the weapon advantage, okay? They have the weapon advantage, maybe 10-1 in artillery. But over the next 6 months, I think that's going to even out and probably switch to being an advantage for the Ukrainians. This is my last chart. So looking at things timeline-wise, you got to worry about Rasputitsa, that mud system in Russia. Okay, so that was in February and March. That's when Putin attacked, and it was kind of a long Rasputitsa season. It may have gone into April. April, May, June, solid ground. July, August, going to be solid ground. September, you never know when Rasputitsa starts. September, maybe solid ground, or Rasputitsa might start towards the end of it. October, I think they're definitely into Rasputitsa again. So I think if you look at this, that Putin's goal is to get that Donetsk Oblast by sometime before the end of September, and then go, oh, I'm a man of peace. I want to cease fire. No more killing. Okay, because he got his territory. Okay, that's my summary. Look forward to the questions.
Bill, thank you very much. Really just presented the exact amount of time you needed. I appreciate that very much. David, it's all yours.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here again today at North County chapter of the San Diego World Affairs Council. Bill, outstanding presentation. It's great setup for what it is that I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to jump over to hopefully my presentation here. And let's try this. All right. So this is my contribution to the update on the war in Ukraine. Coming in, let me see if I can put this away. Great. So my announced plan was to talk about Ukraine's agricultural situation as a result of the war, talk about the prospects for EU membership, reconstruction in Ukraine, and Russia's financial stabilization. Well, things have changed over the last few weeks. For one, the war in Ukraine has moved from a war of maneuver to a war of attrition, of position. It's an artillery war. And as Bill pointed out, Russia holds a very wide advantage in artillery. And has been depending on that advantage to grind out advances in the East and to hold the line by and large against an increasingly spread out, thinned Ukrainian military, which has had great losses. And I wish we had better information. It's interesting how, quite honestly, how slanted reporting is, how selective the reporting is. But between the lines, Ukrainians have lost a tremendous amount of equipment and their best fighters for the most part. And so they're very, very stretched. The Western aid, military aid, it needs to be artillery. That's slow in coming. And in particular, it needs to be shells, ordnance. There was a package here just recently announced out of Washington. Another group of artillery systems headed to Ukraine with a whole bunch of shells. It looks like a big number, but at the fire rate that's going on in Ukraine, that ordnance is going to last a week. So I will tell you straight up that from the Russian side, the Russians don't feel they're losing. And I'm not talking about the Kremlin anymore either. It's the general public. I mean, it's really a preponderant view now is that they're not losing and that time is on their side and that they will ultimately win out. I think this is a particularly tricky time for Ukraine. That the fighting will continue through the summer, and as Bill pointed out, with the change in the weather and ground conditions, very likely to be a pause for both. Essentially be a period of rearm. But in the meantime, it's a very, very dangerous time for the Ukrainians. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, things have changed in the energy world in a very, very big way. And I have to talk about this. It's a whole lot more important than Ukrainian membership in the EU. We can talk about that at another time. Reconstruction is not a big priority in Kiev right now. Maintaining a hold on the Russian military has primacy. But last week, a fire broke out at Freeport LNG in Texas. That's about 20% of US LNG production is now knocked offline. That's a big deal. As Bill pointed out, the Gazprom has slashed the gas flow through Nord Stream 1 to 40% capacity. I am going to talk about Ukraine's agricultural crisis. I'm not sure why these others should be crossed out, and I will talk a bit about the financial stabilization. So at Freeport, this is a kind of a hard graphic to see, but I want to draw your attention to this middle gap. Roughly every month, Freeport LNG produces around 1.4 million tons of LNG. They're going to be offline. Well, they're offline now. There'll be nothing produced the rest of June. They're out July, August, part of September at least. This is I would call this an optimistic projection. As I've dug into the situation at Freeport, they've got a bit of a history of problems there, and I suspect that the regulatory agencies are going to be slow to allow full reopening at Freeport. This is Freeport's export flows. You can see here in the recent months, most of the production has been going to Europe, in particular to UK. This is now offline. Nord Stream situation. This one is very interesting, and certainly politics are part of it, but also the reality of the interference of sanctions in the maintenance of the Nord Stream pipeline. I don't have a map to show, but the last compressor station for the Nord Stream 1 is at Portovaya. There are 4 turbines in that compressor station manufactured by Siemens. They require servicing every 3 or 4 years, and that servicing is done in Canada. It is not a simple thing to remove and reinstall turbines in a compressor station. It will take you some time. Now, what's interesting here is before the politics got flying around, Siemens was very clear that they had informed the Canadian and the German government and that they're working on a solution. This is not the kind of comment that you get if this is strictly about politics or economic warfare, which is very much a factor of what's going on right now. But the deal is here, there are technical issues at stake. So there is one turbine in Canada that cannot be returned to Russia to be reinstalled at Portavaya due to Canadian sanctions. A second turbine that's due for maintenance can't be sent to Canada. So as a result, Gazprom has reduced the flow to 40%, and it occurred over a couple days period, 2 steps. First was the issue about turbine 1, and then the additional with turbine 2. Looking here at the gas flow through Nord Stream 1, as of yesterday, 67 million cubic meters a day is the maximum flow down here. It's a big, steep decline at a time of year where gas flowing from Russia into Europe it very much goes into storage. And so the closure of the reduction in flow through the Nord Stream 1 pipeline, which takes place at 55 atmospheres. It's really intense pressure. So those compressors are a very important part of the technical operation of the pipeline. Along with the accident, the fire at Freeport LNG, Europe is again in a really they're in a jam. Suddenly here it's the middle of June, and the storage filling had been going quite nicely, but that now has got a hiccup. And in 2 days, the price of gas at the British national balance point price point jumped 60%. So, and that's just as of the last 2 days. So I'm going to jump over to Ukraine's agriculture. I got a lot of territory to cover here, so I'm just going to run. Ukrainian agriculture in the last couple decades has really retooled. It is very much a increasingly modernized and mechanized form of agriculture, something that in many ways you'd recognize from the US Midwest. Situation in Ukraine. As a result of the fighting in the east and the southeast, fields have mines. Sorry about an unexploded ordnance in the field. This has kept workers out of the field. This was a bigger issue a few months back as planting was underway. There's quite a bit of infrastructure damage to roads, bridges, collection facilities. The storages are full from last year's harvest due to the cutoff of exports out of Ukraine. There's no place to send those storages, and there's small quantities heading out by road and rail. Talk about that a little later. Kiev was anticipating a cut almost of 50% in the total grain harvest. It turns out that the planting went pretty well by any measure, and realistically, Ukraine's farmers could bring in a crop of maybe 15 to 20% less than last year if everything goes smoothly. A blockade at the ports. This is something that I'm very uncomfortable in discussing because, what is a blockade? In the first days of the war, Russian attacked many of the ports. There were ships, cargo ships that were hit. and essentially the shipping industry shut down. I actually am not aware at the moment, I could be wrong, I'm not aware of the moment of an active blockade. However, the unwillingness of the shipping industry to, firstly, maritime insurance has collapsed. Maritime, you cannot get insurance on cargo in and out of Ukraine at this time. The ports, the Ukrainians mined the ports in the earliest days to keep Russia from launching amphibious attacks into port facilities, which would be, a particularly convenient way to offload attacking forces. There a number of mines came, those mines that were planted by Ukrainian forces. There was a big storm in the middle of March or so that set loose a number of mines. Mines were destroyed by Romanian demolition crews and Turkish demolition crews in the Western Black Sea, including one just outside the Bosphorus. That really woke everybody up to the uncertainties involved in the situation. And again, maritime insurance is very much a factor. It has been a challenge to remove crews stuck on board those ships in what is still an active war zone. Could be active in an hour, could be active right now, it could be active weeks from now, but they're stuck. Turkey has, there's been a great deal of discussion about opening some sort of a corridor to allow for movement of grain cargo out of Ukrainian ports, out of the Black Sea. And Turkey has actually been at the forefront of what I think is probably the most realistic negotiating effort to negotiate a safe transit, and no breakthrough yet. Very curiously, off on the side, the Turks are offering to buy more grain, but at a 25% discount, which is a pretty substantial discount. Everybody's pursuing their interest here, and then all this discussion, that's the deal. Everybody's got an interest, even if it's just an ideological interest. Not a lot of innocence running around anymore. With the ports embargoed, blockaded, or essentially shut down, Ukraine trading companies have been attempting to move some cargo out to ports in Romania. There was a splashy report of a grain ship leaving a Polish port. The system for exporting grain is a highly developed, a technically specific process. The ports in Poland, Baltic states, are not equipped to handle large quantities of grain. The Romanian ports are constrained as well, but there's very much a limit in the rail capacity. I mean, the grain is meant to move in Ukraine from north to south, not to the west. Another important thing is the rail gauge incompatibilities in the old Soviet world, if you will, and that includes Afghanistan and Mongolia and all the territories of the former USSR, including the Baltic states. Ukraine, Belarus use the broad gauge, which is, and Europe uses the standard gauge. So you can't roll a train. You have to switch cars or transfer to a different wheel set, which is time consuming under the best of circumstances. Inside Ukraine, local traders are reluctant to buy. They are very much concerned about the war risk. They are concerned about holding property, essentially. and having the storage facility attacked or damaged, destroyed in fighting. So there's a great deal of financial risk there, and the local traders are reluctant to take that on board. They are offering to buy grain from Ukrainian farmers. However, they're in order to provide the margin for to cover that risk, but also to take advantage of the situation. The Ukrainian traders are offering very large discounts to the market price. So there's not a lot of grain being traded. Farmers is sitting. This year, fuel is tight, fertilizer is tight, but it's available enough. The same with agrochemicals that are pesticides, herbicides that are used in the fields. That has been adequate this year. However, the lack of cash due to unsold inventories, there is extreme concern that regardless of how the war goes, there's extreme concern that Ukrainian agriculture will be unable to procure the necessary supplies for next year's growing season. Much of this year's growing season, the war started on February 24th. A great deal of the material necessary for this year's growing season was already in place, minus the fuels. Okay, this is a complicated chart, but we need to sit here for a minute. The top part is exports. Okay, the bottom part is production. This is global production, global exports. The category on the left is corn, followed by rice, followed by soybeans, followed by wheat. I'll point out that in the world of corn, the United States, this kind of reddish color, the United States is a big player in corn production and exports. Ukraine is a significant producer, but they play an outsized role in exports. Neither Ukraine or Russia play much of a factor in rice or, quite frankly, in soybeans. In wheat, in particular, winter wheat is the thing to keep an eye on. Ukraine is a modest producer in the global scheme of things, but is a very substantial exporter. Russia is a large producer and also a very large exporter. Just on wheat, European Union is the world's leader. China is second. We're not used to, you don't hear that in these news reports. What you hear endlessly are exports and imports, those which are very important, of course, but exports, traded grain is about 20% or so of the global grain supply. So in fact, China is 2, India is a big player, and now you can see where Russia, US, Australia, Ukraine, Pakistan, Canada, Argentina. From Ukraine's perspective, Ukraine is a major player in traded grains. Number 2 in barley, number 4 in corn, and corn is a big international grain trade. Ukraine has 50% of the sunflower oil market. This is a big thing in the lower income countries in particular. Rapeseed, canola oil, wheat. So just a quick review, Russia produces about 11% of the world's wheat. Ukraine produces about 3%. Russia accounts for about 19% of global wheat exports, Ukraine 9%. Ukraine is a big player in the corn export market, about 14% of the global market. Neither is a major factor in rice or soybeans. In the winter wheat, these are the winter wheat growing areas in Ukraine. And as you can see, this cross hatch area is territory seized by Russia during this invasion, and also in the previous fighting in 2014. But most of this is a result of what's taken place this year. And a significant chunk of Ukraine's winter wheat territory is now under Russian control. And these farmers are still growing, and there's actually been quite a bit of effort by the Russians to set up systems by which this grain is exported out of Sea of Azov port facilities. It'll come under the Russian name. Corn production in Ukraine is more to the north, but now I'll take you back one step. Russia now controls substantial areas of these two provinces here, which are very important corn growing regions in Ukraine. Ukraine has got a real problem in terms with their storage is being filled. Harvest has already begun in the area southwest of Odessa, and in the areas along the south and in the steppe region, in the central and southern regions of Ukraine. The harvest will kick into force over the next few weeks. There's very little time. Really, they've run out of time, quite frankly, in terms of being able to move stuff out of storage. Presents a huge problem. I'll look at that. It's a terrible map in terms of visibility, but these are the primary ports along the Black Sea. You can barely make it out, I'm sorry here. But primarily 4 major ports. Mykolaiv, about a fifth of Ukraine's exports. The planting has gone very well. However, on June 4th, the Russians shelled the Nikotera grain port, just a private port built over the last decade. It's one of the most advanced grain ports in the world. It is a huge facility. It is designed state-of-the-art, high flow through, where you're able to maintain high quality cargo. That's another issue about sending things by trucks and trains halfway across Europe, is that it affects the quality of the cargo, and the buyers don't like degraded grain arriving when they've paid full price. But this is just a straight up attack, and was designed to knock out this crucial piece of infrastructure in Ukraine. This knocked out many of the storage units, and in particular the grain conveyors and the loading and unloading equipment. Wish I had more time to cover on this. These are piles of sunflower cake. It's after the oil is removed from sunflower seeds. The cake is highly valued as animal feed. These piles. These are about 30 feet high. Some farmers not far from Mykolaiv, just to look at the people that are involved. These are serious farmers, highly experienced, internet savvy, highly aware of what's happening in a very granular way, what's happening in markets in their neighborhood and worldwide. Let's quick look at some of the fields. Come to the rail gauge. I mentioned that a few minutes ago. The green is broad gauge system. Finland goes both ways. This blue is standard gauge. It's a real impediment, and logistics impediment. And we're talking about moving millions of tons here. This is not moving a few boxes or a container load or that. Many millions of tons, and you need to have efficient movement of cargo to make it work. Otherwise, it's
David,
just
we
a
have 5
demonstration.
minutes, please.
Okay. All right. So one of the opportunities to deal with excess, lack of storage is temporary storage. These are temporary storages, temporary storage solutions that you'll find in the U.S. Midwest. It's industrial scale storage. Temporary. It's just a matter of being able to get this type of solution, and the Europeans certainly have these kinds of technologies available as well. The stuff is out there, the solutions are out there. The question is, can they be gotten on site in time? It doesn't solve the problem with you need to sell your grain so that you can buy fuel, fertilizer, seed, agrochemicals for the next year, pay your staff as well. So nighttime loading. The scale of this is quite extensive. So Russia's emerging stabilization. This is real. I really do get fatigued with the selective reporting that goes on. But let's cut to the chase here. Inside Russia, retail sales have been crushed. Yet very clear signs of bottoming taking place. These are car sales. Just let's look at the black line, which is 2022. Big impact of the war. But in May, a very clear slowing of the rate of decline. I suspect that June and July will be essentially a bottom, and you'll begin to see a climb going into the fall. This is the Russia's Purchasing Managers Index. I'm sure you hear about such things for the United States as well. There's a Purchasing Managers Index for manufacturing, services, and a composite. In this index, yellow is manufacturing. And in fact, in Russia, manufacturing index has moved into positive territory. It's moved over 50. So manufacturing in Russia is now expanding. Services are still in the negative side, and 2/3 of Russians work in services. So this is a really important sector. It's really the majority of the economy in Russia is services. However, that is clearly recovering, still in a negative territory, but it's pretty clear where things are headed. On interest rates, despite the very high inflation, which has begun to recede modestly, the central bank has been cutting interest rates once the initial run on the ruble, kind of a rush by foreigners and Russians to get cash out of the country. Once that panic ended, the central bank has been cutting interest rates. And now the purpose of the cutting of the interest rates is to restore economic activity, not to fight inflation, but to provide financial liquidity for the economy to go through this very difficult structural transition that lies in front of it. Looking at the ruble exchange rate, very, very stable, very stable until the war. This shows the exchange rate is not a psychological thing. This is buyers and sellers. This is supply and demand. And when the exchange rate, when the ruble dollar soared against the ruble, essentially, this was an imbalance of people selling rubles and buying other currencies. That came to a stop. And now the ruble actually has become overstrong. It's actually a significant problem. With the sanctions on finance, the central bank of Russia does not have the ability to stash hard currency in banks offshore. That the reserves that's the reserves that were seized via sanctions, frozen via sanctions at the end of February, Russia, the central bank, no longer has that tool to manage the exchange rate. So this is actually a really big headache for Russian export industry. And it's going to be a real challenge to deal with going forward. Okay, so why is that the case? Russia's supposed to be a basket case now, and the economy is supposed to be going to hell in a handcart. Well, there's a couple. The key thing here is actually cash flow. Again, it's buy and sell. Well, this is the current account balance for Russia looking over about a 15-year period. The black line showing very, very, very strong current account surplus. In part because of crude oil sales, product sales, natural gas. But the factor that has really supercharged the current account surplus for Russia is the sanctions have halted trade imports into Russia, and even more importantly, has stopped Russians from traveling abroad. So money that would have been spent outside of Russia is not being spent. And the result is a very strong current account surplus. And this will result in a very strong ruble. And it also means that Russia as a country is in an unusually strong financial situation. We can talk more about this in the future. Certainly the Kremlin gets a piece of it. But anybody that thinks that the Russian economy is somehow being sent to the Stone Age via sanctions, the facts are this is not the case. And the discussion in the circles that I share is a debate over how soon, how long, how deep the effect of the technological sanctions will be, and how serious, how long-term will the impact actually be. And I'm coming around to the view that while the technological sanctions are quite severe and are the most severe on Russia, most severe, that in 2023, but in particularly 2024, you're going to see that the effect of those sanctions be considerably reduced. Yes, Russia is facing restrictions on selling oil and particular oil products via self-sanctioning and sanctions restricting oil sales into Europe. However, Russian oil exports remain unchanged on a global basis. Exports to India and China are very strong. Both countries are paying a very discounted price. So at this time, the product sales, diesel, gasoline, particular from Russia into Europe, that has come, is nearing a stop. And it's the effect on that trade that has reduced refinery runs in Russia and has reduced Russia's domestic oil production. However, the fact is that Russia's crude oil exports are robust and essentially unchanged on a global basis. Thank you.
David, thank you very much. We're all very much on time. Q&A.
Farouk, I'd like to say one thing. It's
Yes,
just
please.
that, as in past flashpoints, we will continue the recording throughout the Q&A.
Good. Thank you for saying that. John Langdon, I hope I did not mess up your last name. That will be number one. And Mary Agnew will follow. So John, it's yours to ask a question.
Well, he's got a question in the chat box here. He's asking how much oil and gas can Russia sell to China?
And to India too.
And to India too. I don't have the specific numbers in front of me. In terms of China, initially, the Chinese were slow to say about a third of Russia's crude oil exports are out of East Coast ports, and the primary buyer is China. There were some hiccups out of those East Coast ports because sanctions interfered with payments for tanker services, but also payments for crude. Those seem to have been worked out. While Sakhalin 1 and Sakhalin 2 crude flows are reduced, the crude flows out of the East Siberian pipeline at Kosmino are actually accelerated. The Russians have added diluents to the crude flow to increase the flow. Only about 10 billion cubic meters or so of gas sales to China. There's no link between the West Siberian gas fields, but the gas supply through the Power of Siberia will increase over the next couple of years to around 30 billion cubic meters, with another project to add 10 billion. India has been the surprise to all of this. India is a long way from Russia, and because of the expense of cargo prior to the war, it didn't make much sense to ship Russian crude to India. It was a very small, minuscule percentage. However, Russia has been offering large discounts around the order of 30% to India, and the Indians have been big buyers. The other related, part of that system is that most of the Russian crude exports to Europe are out of small tankers. In order to make the sailing to India or to China through the Red Sea or around the Horn of Africa, you needed to use larger tankers. So, in fact, there's a burgeoning ship-to-ship transfer of crude off the Azores and in the Mediterranean, going from smaller tankers to bigger tankers, is helping the Russians and Indians and Chinese make it work in terms of the logistics. The insurance embargo looked like it was going to be a big problem, but the Russian insurance companies have stepped in, and it seems that the Indians and the Chinese are finding that acceptable. So while there's some impediments to the flows, it looks like they're going to be sustained. I don't see much of an impact of insurance. We'll get turbulence, but I think in net the flows. I've got the charts here to give you. I just don't have the specific numbers, John. Sorry.
Thank you.
Mary Agnew, followed by Bob Mayer.
Yeah, I started out, I put in my thing for one question, but your discussion, Dave, a little bit later on near the end threw me completely. From what I can see on your statistics, this war isn't hurting Russia at all, except for the loss of life of those poor guys who are sent out to fight. Economically, they're doing just fine.
Well, there is a big hit going on. This is a powerful recession, a shock that has hit Russia. No mistake. And while there is a bottoming process going on, it's a pretty significant bottom. And the technological sanctions have really complicated important trade, important imports for Russia, and Bill was talking about Huawei, yeah, indeed, Huawei, the Chinese are respecting the sanctions boundaries, and Huawei has stepped back, very much to the Russians' consternation. The Russians have been hit. The impact of the pandemic seems to have been a bigger hit,
Yeah.
at least in terms of consumer demand.
Well, I saw that even the manufacturing and everything else, there was a huge dip around 2020, but it's right like back up where it was before.
Yeah. My thought was even, in March that, we'd be looking at some sort of, something like what took place in the 1990s, but I don't think it's going to be like that. I actually think that the shock is going to be relatively transitory. And this gets to my really deep concerns about the sanctions process, is that, well, what was the point of the sanctions? Is the point of the sanctions to knock Russia out of the war, or is this to degrade Russia's capacity going forward? And I'll tell you who's getting degraded. It's the low income world. The sanctions is going to turn out to be a very messy, very painful thing. And yeah.
Okay, I got a comment here too. This is economic. It's economic. It's my.
No. Because I have your name down.
Yeah.
Okay.
We'll save that question for you, Bill, later when our turn comes back.
Okay.
Okay, you'll get it, believe me. Bob Mayer followed by Bob Ning.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you could make a couple of comments about the grain harvest health in places like Canada, India, China, US, Russia, and what the impact of that is.
Right. Well, if I wasn't, yeah, if I wasn't talking to you guys right now, I'd be on the north central US drought and agriculture call, and I could tell you a whole lot more. Actually, the health of the US ag season, summer grain season looks pretty good. There are some areas of serious impact in winter wheat in Kansas and Oklahoma, but by and large, while it's important, it's not pivotal in any way. There's dryness in Europe, Western Europe. Actually, this is going to be an interesting summer in Western Europe. It's affecting the quality of the wheat crop, and will affect other crops as well. It's also we're looking at very low river flows, which is going to impact barge traffic throughout Europe, and will actually affect the ability of Europe to switch refineries from Russian crudes off the Druzhba pipeline. There were hopes that they could barge and pipe and rail into some of the deep inland refineries. Well, that's going to be a challenge. It's going to be a tough year for Europe. India looks. They had that wicked heat wave about a month ago. It hasn't, in fact, impacted the grain situation, but in the last week, the state agencies in India, much of the grain that's moved in and out of India is private sector, but the state agencies that manage some of the contracts with other countries, they have reemerged. So my sense is that things are not so bad in India. Globally, it looks like it's an okay year, minus the fact that Ukraine is essentially knocked out of the global ag market, and Russian cargoes are in question and may be intermittent, depending on what all happens in the Black Sea.
I've heard that China had a pretty bad wheat harvest this year.
I could be. I don't know.
Okay. Bob Nink, followed by John Holbrook.
My question is, assuming by September this year, Putin would happily declare victory, he would have finished his campaign in Donbass region, would Ukraine be able to go along with ceasefire? Because I'm thinking especially of the ocean outlet they have limited to Odessa. Would they be agreeable to stop?
Bill, why don't you take a crack at that? And
Oh,
I'll
okay.
come in later.
Yeah, I don't think so, Bob. I think that, and of course, this depends upon, how much aid they get from the West. But remember, they got like 5 billion out of 40 billion or more of the US aid already. So that's a very small amount of the 40 billion.
Right.
So I think more aid is coming, not only military aid, but also economic aid. Okay. So do I think, if France, Italy, and Germany say, hey, we're not supporting Ukraine anymore, nobody's going to notice the difference because they haven't done anything yet so far, at least in a military sense. So I think if the UK and the US and the Baltics and the Scandinavian countries continue to support Ukraine, Ukraine will not agree to giving up a huge amount of territory, despite what Macron thinks is reasonable. Okay, so I think that if and it's very possible that Putin gets the Donbass before September, before Rasputitsa, that the Ukrainians are not going to go, and he goes, hey, ceasefire, I don't want to have any more deaths. The Ukrainians are going to go, yeah, no more deaths when you leave the country and give us back our territory. So I don't think that that's going to work as a ceasefire. I don't see that. Okay,
Yeah.
Dave?
Yeah, I really agree with Bill here. What I see is a pause, and it could be for several months, where essentially the fighting it goes to at a very low level. It'll be interesting to see how the world news and the media cycle deals with that. The real is it. I've had some interesting conversations with U.S. Navy people in the last week, and there's nobody interested in getting into the convoy business. And even if there was, it would require Ukraine to create channels through the minefields that they have reasonably laid. So far, Ukrainians are not interested in doing that because it would open potentially that Russian forces could use those same channels to enter Ukrainian ports, if not for amphibious assaults, but even to do some hit and run shelling, which could be really nasty in terms of damage to infrastructure and all. So I see this as, I do not see, I don't see these ports opening up. And now, even if you open up the sea lanes, Nicotera is out of action. I mean, that's 15-20% of Ukraine's export capacity was running through that facility. You're welcome to take a boat and dock it, but it's not going to get loaded. This is another thing is that the clash in time scales here is really important, and everybody needs to take this away. We have our clock, we have our rhythm of life and our expectations, and the clock is different in Russia. The rhythm and the expectations are different. The initial phase of regime change failed miserably, a disaster. But now it's in for the long game. And the slide that Bill put up, the Putin's comment about Peter the Great, well, it was kind of a shake and the rattle here of warning, and the view inside Russia was, yeah, we're in for the long haul, because for the Russian domestic population, the vast majority of that population now sees this conflict for what it is, that is indeed multidimensional, and that the rollout of sanctions, it's economic warfare. It's no longer about Ukraine. This is now about Russia. And will this war evolve into a more expanded military conflict? Well, we'll see in the years to come. This is going to go on for a while. You know, in World War I, you know, anybody that made their projections based on what took place in August and September, well, that war turned a whole lot different than what took place in August and September of 1914. So no, I don't see a ceasefire, nor do I see a pause resulting in the opening of Ukrainian grain exports through the Black Sea.
Thank you.
John Holbrook, followed by Bill Thayer.
Okay, hey, Dave, I got a question for you.
Okay, you could do
Two
that.
questions. Two questions. Okay, but no. One question on
Yeah.
what is the latest percentage? I think the Europeans have the capacity to store underground or wherever in their containers natural gas, 100 billion cubic meters. What percent are they filled up to at this point in time?
I'd say roughly a quarter.
Okay.
You know, filling of storage was actually a bit ahead of what's taken place over previous 5 years. It was a pretty good season, very pricey gas, but a pretty good season. Now the flows, this is the problem at the shutoff at Freeport, and now the slowdown out of Nord Stream. And what's interesting is that so far there are no additional Russian exports through the Ukrainian lines, which are still operational. That's the interesting part for me. That's where I'm got my eyes right now. But the storage filling is basically come to a stop. The flows that are coming in are essentially used to keep the industry and power sector going. So they're not going to make their storage numbers.
Hey, my second question real quick. How about July 28th for the second for another follow-up flashpoint? July 28th.
Okay. Yeah,
Okay.
but let's talk about that. But
Okay.
yes. Okay.
Okay. All right. John Holbrook, please.
Yes. Given what Russia did to Chechnya, are they also willing to turn Ukraine into rubble?
Yes.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Absolutely. I mean, that's what they're doing. They're pulverizing and moving a little bit forward. So that's their MO, is to do that. That's what's working for them. And so that's what they're going to do.
Yeah, what happened in Chechnya was essentially a fallback to an old tried and true system of artillery. So if you want to see, you know, World War I, get your history books out, get those pictures. That's it. That's the deal. This is not World War II, which was by and large a war maneuver, accepting Stalingrad or Berlin. They'll pound it to dust.
Yeah. So if the artillery evens up or even gets to be less than a 10-to-1 advantage for the Russians, they're going to slow down, because that's what they're counting on this big advantage to move forward.
They have it, and I do not see, this is the thing. That's why the tone of my talk changed, the whole tenor. I don't see we're behind. The West is behind in supplying not only the systems, but the ordnance. That's the key. I mean, if you're in an artillery duel and you run out of ordnance, you got a problem, and it's fatal. So, and the Ukrainians know this. They have used up all the ammunition essentially for the 152 millimeter, the old Soviet era systems. You know, they've cleaned out much of Eastern Europe, those old storages for, you know, the old T-72 tanks, the old artillery, old ordnance. They're really scraping the bottom. And so this business about, you know, Ukrainians want 1,000 155s, which, yes, but even more, this is where their hair is on fire. It's ordnance. And if they're not able to sustain, you know, their side of an artillery duel, then you can see some localized collapses. The Russians don't seem to have the capacity for any large scale breakout wars of maneuver, but increasingly the logistics supply is looking a lot healthier. It's the US in particular has to get serious about the supply of ordnance on the Ukrainian schedule, not ours.
Yeah, I would second that. And I think that what's going to happen is the Ukrainians did have these 152 millimeters. They're running out of ammunition. I think those things are just going to be tossed to the side. And I think they're going to transition to NATO 155 millimeter ammunition. I mean, that's just the way it's going to go. And it's going to, how quickly is the West going to make that happen? That's the real question.
Agreed.
Alfred, followed by Tibor.
Okay, my question is for David. You mentioned well, the grain exports have been affected with this war. And if it reaches a point where, typically for Africa, that it might cause famine in the near future, are we prepared, or is the United Nations, not we, preparing for just such a catastrophe where we start seeing starvation? And if that was to be the case, can Asian rice supplement or replace corn for such an event?
Well, so I'm not really competent to speak about how easily one can substitute grains into, you know, traditional cuisines. I mean, you know, how one cooks rice is different than corn or wheat, you know, and
In Asia, that's the staple.
say again.
In Asian countries, rice is the staple.
Right.
You know.
Yeah, I get that. But I think if you take rice to Somalia, I'm not sure. You know,
if they're dying,
well, maybe. Okay, so there are two tracks to this. The track that's gotten almost all the airplay is the stoppage of Ukrainian grain exports to markets abroad, North Africa in particular, Middle East. In sub-Saharan Africa, it's more of a factor of the price of fertilizer. And that's a spinoff of the price of natural gas. And as long as natural gas prices were already at a toxic, and I mean toxic level for global agriculture before the war. It's just that nobody was talking about it. Now those prices have been sustained into the war, and by all measures, I don't see any decline in global gas prices. So the price of fertilizer is going to remain high. In lower income countries, they are going to economize the application of fertilizer. The yields will be less, so the harvests will be less, and you'll get a harvest. It won't be like complete famine, but that degraded, you'll have what's it called, food security. We're going to have it here, but shh, you know, that's it's un-America to talk about such things, right? Well, you know, San Diego, let me tell you, with the utilities and with, you know, gas costs and rental costs, you know, shh, food security is a big deal here. We just won't have too many people starving to death. They'll just get sick, you know, and they'll go maybe more people in
have
the hospital.
the formula, yeah.
So, but in terms of that, it actually is a challenge to get to transition to switch grain to you know, to go from, you know, rice, or to go from corn to rice. I'm not a cook. My son is. I'm not a cook.
If
But
you're
he-
that starvation,
Hold on.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thibault, please.
Thank you. Very interesting. You know, when I'm watching this war, I keep remembering many US military personnel criticizing micromanagement of the Vietnam War and not bombing Haiphong and all the military and other supplies flowing into Vietnam, prolonging the war and the casualties, increasing the casualties. When I look at the bombing of Serbia over Kosovo, it was going on for quite a while. Then we knocked out the electrical system. We didn't need to bomb the power plants. It was pretty easy to just the high tension wires to be shorted out and the transformer stations, which are pretty easy to restore. But shortly after that, when many of the high-rise apartments no longer had water in Belgrade, they threw in the towel. So we in Ukraine, you know, there is the Kerch Bridge, what the Ukrainians could have bombed and disrupted. Then when we have weapons sales, the Ukrainians have to sign papers that they're not going to use it on Russian territory. Then the Russians may be bombing the railroads, but apparently in areas where the Ukrainians could restore it. These European leaders just went with a railroad to Kiev, which they could have brought in some of the weapons with them. And so what I see is here, the railroad system is working, the electrical system is working, the water system is working. There is fuel in Ukraine, even if it's on short supply. So is anybody really looking into a low human cost of disrupting the war efforts on either side so these people would stop fighting?
That's the question.
That's the question. So is there a chance for escalation or looking into different targets where you not necessarily target people or populations, but infrastructure, so the war will stop because there is, you know, untenable to continue?
Okay.
Well, I guess-
Would you like to answer that to David?
Well, I think there's been some of that. Nicotera, for example. It turns out that knocking down when I was going to university, I spent a summer working on a powder crew. We were doing the cuts for the I-15 up by Lawrence Welks, changing from the 395 to I-15, and got a chance to work with real explosives there. And it turns out that knocking something down, like a bridge, it turns out that, you know, the cruise missiles and things like that aren't very effective at knocking out bridges. They damage them for a while, but you can fix them pretty easily. Some of the infrastructure the Russians would like to keep. It would be really inconvenient to blow up, say, the nuclear facilities at Zaporozhye. That would be kind of like bringing it on yourself. I hear what you're asking. Neither side has the capability to do just that. That's in my view. Bill, what do you think?
My understanding is that for electrical wires, you could just have conductive wires dispersed over a high tension wire or transformer station, and you could knock the whole station out. It's not that difficult to restore, but it's certainly you could continue disrupting it.
Well, I think it's all pretty much one-sided. I mean, it would only be Russia knocking out the infrastructure in Ukraine. Obviously, Ukrainians can't knock out infrastructure in Russia. Okay, so it's just one way. And so far they haven't done it. And I think if you're looking west of the Dnieper River, if they had a really first-class Air Force, they probably could, but I don't think they do. And so I don't think they can, even if they want to. Now, is Ukraine going to knock out infrastructure in the Donetsk region? I mean, I think that's really kind of a, who cares? You know?
So I think this is a good question that you raised, Tibor. My answer is inadequate. And I would say it's something to keep an eye on. That's all I could say there. But it's pretty close to a total war, you know. I mean, if somebody has the capacity to make a mark, you know, and the Ukrainians have attacked into Russia. You know, openly at Bryansk, some oil storage facilities, with a helicopter raid. I mean, that was just overt, you know, and then the possibility of some covert activities, but something like laying chafe down on power lines, yeah, I get it. Technically, it's seems, you know, why not? But I don't know. I don't know why not, why it hasn't been done yet. It's a good question.
Does anybody else who have not asked any questions before I go to the second list? Okay. Bob Mayer, followed by Bobby.
Yeah, me. I
Oh,
have,
Jim, go ahead, please.
gentlemen, what I hear you telling us is that we're looking maybe at a long war. But what I'm wondering, and my question is, how do you assess the current objective of the European countries in NATO in terms of the outcome of this war? Is it just Ukraine? Is it the bigger thing we hear them talking about, keeping Russia from doing it elsewhere in the next so many years? You're talking about a long game. Is that what they're thinking? What do you think their current objectives are?
The Europeans, the NATO members of Europe.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I'll give Dave a shot at this, but let me try first. I think that Finland and Sweden don't want to have what happened to Ukraine happen to them. That's why they're joining. Okay. I think that the Baltics, when they hear Putin talk about reclaiming Slavic lands, are scared that he will actually do that. And so, yes, do I think they absolutely want to have NATO defend their country? Absolutely. And so, like the Germans, they've got like 1,000 troops in Lithuania, and then they were going to go up to 1,500, and then they're going up to 3,000. And now the latest thing is they're going to put them on an alert in Germany, and they'll get them to Lithuania if they need. So the Germans are just doing nothing. So I think the core of NATO, which I would call the old core, France, Italy, Germany, basically is doing nothing. But that core, that borderline area that's all right next to Russia, man, this is really real to them. And NATO protection for them is absolutely paramount.
Yeah, but wait now. Yesterday you said Russia, you said Germany, France, and Italy, blah, blah, blah. The presidents of those countries were in Kiev yesterday.
Yeah, I know. And how many howitzers did they bring with them? Zero. Nothing.
Awesome.
They haven't given them any aid whatsoever. And it kind of scares you if you're Lithuania and you have the Germans promise a bunch of troops and then not come through with the troops. You know, you wonder, like, how are they going to do if Article 5 happens and the Russians happen to invade us? What are they going to do? They're going to go like, well, let's see, we got to talk about this for a while. You know, 24 hours would be enough if nobody helped the Baltics. You know, the Russians would take it over. So I think that eastern side is really, NATO is paramount. Okay, NATO protection, absolutely. It's a big deal.
Okay, anybody?
Yeah.
Go
So I
ahead.
want to, I do have
Go ahead.
something on this, and I wanted to come back to Tibor for just a second, that on a regional basis, the Russians have been attacking fuel facilities. And in the last weeks, and again, Nikotera is an example of this, paying greater attention at knocking out infrastructure. It's a part of the change in the tone of the war. Now, in terms of NATO, Russia, doctrine, this has been a learning experience for everybody, and some of the lessons have been really, really painful. The Ukrainians have experienced the worst of them. And the idea in NATO was that tripwires would be set up. You'd have light forces in places like in the Baltics or Eastern, Poland or elsewhere. You'd have, and once those you draw the Russians in and stretch their lines and attack them. And the experience actually has been in Ukraine is the incredible devastation of war. Okay, and that's something that really everyone needs to take on, and it gets back to how much of this really had to happen. I mean, it was kind of like hit me. Well, it got hit, and it's a flipping disaster. And where Ukraine ends up out of this in the long run, I don't know. But certainly the Baltic countries are totally correct in calling out and rejecting the idea of tripwire defense theory, because you have within an invasion and attack, the devastation that would be incurred on the cities right there on the border, when you're barely tripping the wire. And I do think it's kind of awkward, for the Germans to have kind of step back in a sense and say, yeah, we'll fight from Germany. And the same kind of question needs to be asked about the US as well, because I mean, NATO, it's the US. Come on, let's be real. And maybe ultimately the Germans rearm, and that presents a different kind of a Europe, but we're a long way from that. I do think that, and I have said this before, and I will say it again, that it is the solution here, unfortunately, is a military one. That's the only kind of force that the Kremlin and indeed the Russian public will ultimately respect. Sanctions? No. We are the ones that will pay the price, or even worse, it'll be people in the low income developing world that'll pay a horrific price, and we will not be there to bail them out. I mean, take a look at what happened during the pandemic. That was a good case run, a good test run of how the world will react in a crisis situation. We get a lot of press about flying a few bags of grain, from the Midwest with a nice US label on it. But will it actually change anything? No. I don't know. Sorry about that. So.
Okay. Anybody
I think
else?
it's gonna be military
Anybody
too.
else who have not asked a question? I'm sorry. Bill.
I think it's going to be, I agree with Dave. I think it's going to be a military solution here.
We have Bob Mayer and Bob Ming. Bob Mayer. Robert.
Yeah, where did you go?
Is already gone. And
Bob Mayer left his comment. He has a comment in chat. He may have left.
Oh, that's right. Yes, you're right. Bob, you go ahead if you have any question.
Okay, my question follows the discussion that we were just hearing, expecting that a long conflict, a long war. Now I turn to the Russian side. What is the possibility that Putin would either have personal health issues or a change in political wind in Russia that we could have a change there, that Russia would be more reasonable, less aggressive. David, you have insights in Russia. Does Putin have a protege? Is there someone from KGB will be like him? How well supported is he to continue the Peter the Great vision for Russian Federation?
Well, that Peter the Great vision is kind of this is a repackaging of what all is going on. Yes, it's something. It's something to pay attention to, because it calls into question. If you go back to the kind of an ultimatum that the Kremlin issued, I believe it was in December, it may have been in November, saying that the security arrangement in Eastern Europe will be changed, will be amended, and these are our terms. That's kind of what this Peter the Great thing is playing into. This is about establishing, or not relitigating, a stupid term for a wartime situation, but contesting the strategic realities of Eastern Europe. That's in play, and that's why NATO, the role of NATO is in question, and they need to be serious. And it is a military solution here, and that's got to be taken on board. We kind of dialed up a war here, and the Ukrainians did, and everybody did. So it's a military solution is necessary if the Russians are going to be deterred. Now, inside Russia, it's kind of a curious vibe right now. Overwhelmingly, it's more than a plurality. Overwhelmingly, the role, what Russia is doing in Ukraine, is supported. There's less sense of pressure on Putin. He may have a health problem. A lot of talk about him having a health problem, a serious one. Does he have a protege? No. If there was one, the fellow died in an accident last fall outside of Norilsk. But Patrushev is probably the most visible power player, if you will, within the power structure in Russia right now. If Putin died today, there would not be this war would continue essentially unchanged. Putin is under some pressure for not executing the war well and not doing it better. There is pressure to do it better. No one should get the idea that there's some sort of Mikhail Gorbachev or modernizer or a peacenik in the background. No.
May I comment?
Because we have one question, one person who have not asked any questions.
Can I do think it's fair that the bill, this is a good one. We got time for that question.
Absolutely. Go ahead.
Okay. So I think that Putin is probably not under, great pressure right now, because economically, I think with the $200 billion war chest and the ability to sell energy abroad, that he's still doing okay, and he can prop up the ruble. I don't know that the economy is so propped up. And Mary, you were going to ask me another question on that, but I think it's propped up the ruble okay. But I think when we get towards the end of the year, it's going to be a very different situation. When you start getting a lot of unemployment and a lot of people that are unhappy, I mean, if we look back to World War I and the Tsar, a lot of people were really unhappy then, and that's instability for the leader, even if you're an absolute leader. So I think there is a possibility that Putin could go at some point in time, not in the next 3 months.
Okay, Claudia, you next, please.
Actually, I was just typing it in the chat because it's not a question, it's just a comment, and it's really fast. You were talking about substituting one grain for another. And I don't know if you're familiar with the 1850s potato famine, which of course is complicated in its own set, but the United States sent corn to Ireland, but it couldn't be used for grain because you have to mill it a couple of times, and they had no mills. So it was useless to them. So that's just something to add to that, question, that it's not just personal taste. It may also be what kind of facilities you actually
Very
have.
much so. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Bill, do you have a comment?
Pardon? Oh, no. Well, no, I'm not going to comment on that.
No need for comments.
Well, yeah.
Okay, we have about 3 minutes left. And let me make just one comment with regard to the situation. People talk about does that need to be the only solution is a war, complete war. There's some wars of attrition have taken place within the 20th century. And that is the one in Iraq and the one in Afghanistan. Okay, they were wars of attrition. It ended up in some kind of negotiation to solve it. Okay, and this is coming from a most powerful country on the face of the earth. Okay, on this side. In 1939, Stalin attacked Finland, and Finland withdrew a war of attrition. And at the end of it, it was resolved by having negotiations. If any one of you would like to make a comment on that, please go ahead.
I think the Iran-Iraq war might actually be a better analog. I actually think that Zelensky, while he's a profoundly effective wartime leader, that in a road to peace setting or a peaceful setting, he is going to have his hands full with the right wing, if you call it that, the nationalist wing in Ukrainian politics, and they are not going to go quietly into the night. They're going to fight, and if Zelensky won't do the fighting, they'll get somebody else. As long as the war is on and overt fighting is going on, Zelensky's position is strong. But no one should think that will carry very long into peacetime. Look at oh gosh, the British in World War II. Oh, help me. Churchill. Yeah, I mean, Churchill was great during the war, and then
absolutely
blew up, and then there's nothing.
So the question is, negotiations, will this end in negotiations? Is that what you're saying? At some point, but it's pretty far out there. I think obviously it will, and I would say before negotiations happen, I would put a higher probability on Putin being out of office before negotiations happen. I think he's going to be pretty rigid. So I don't think there's too much hope there. But if he's out of office and somebody else gets in, I think that very well could be, there could be negotiations.
Yeah, I think the war intensifies before something, we're going to get a pause at the end of the summer. The forces on both sides are pretty much exhausted, and the Ukrainians will be interested in it to get their ordnance in the field that they don't have. And similar things with the Russians. So their manpower situation is better than it was. My fear is, though, that I don't see, the Iran-Iraq war, when things got ugly, Saddam reached for alternative means and used chemical weapons against Iranians. It was it was an ugly affair. I at the moment, I can't think of any really good analogies. You know, you kind of maybe hope for the World War I analogy where, you know, the German domestic situation completely came unglued and went into a revolutionary situation, and then that took the Germans out of the war. But that's not what's coming in Russia. And I just really have got to stand here on this ruble thing. This is not some sort of state support for the ruble. This is cash flow, pure and simple. There's plenty of money around. There is the prospect of some significant unemployment. I just think that the Russian society is they can deal with it individually. There'd be a lot of great costs, great pain, and I know people that are still on their way out. But I also know that people have dug in, and they still have their dachas. There's not going to be food shortages anywhere. I'm actually quite impressed with the resilience of the system right now.
Okay, so I got to say, just watch that over time, because I think time is not on the Russian side. I think the
Here,
economy.
and here we
Now,
disagree.
my thing with the energy, do you agree with my numbers on the energy dropping by December, the export money coming into Russia?
I don't, because I mean, if
Do you want to put up some numbers next time and say what you think is going to happen over the next 6 months, and I'll put up my numbers, and we'll
yeah,
you know,
yeah. I mean, I actually
Okay.
think that's really important, because the
Okay.
design of the design of the sanctions, you know, in a kind of linear thinking way, Europe is thinking by sanctioning Russian oil that they're going to have a material impact, and it'll be this reduction of income. It turns out that, as was thought at the beginning, you know, that Russian crude exports would go to Asia, and they're finding a way, and they'll make their. If you take $110 oil and you put a 30% discount on it, and you're getting, let's just be generous, make it a big discount, and you're getting $80 a barrel for your discounted oil, you're doing pretty well. And I was clear in January in the presentation that in my view, and I stand by it, that that gas exports are not a decisive factor in Russian finance in any way. But for oil, it is significant. But the reality is that because the price structure is so high, and because they're able to move volumes into Asia, that they're going to sustain essentially their income. You need a recession in the West to knock energy prices up.
Okay, and I would say in the long term, I disagree with that. And we'll put up our numbers, and we'll just keep track of that over the upcoming months. But I think it's not only a question of money coming into Russia. I think it's also a question of employment. You got people up at Norilsk, and those people are going to be out of a job. They're not going to walk down the street and get another job. Okay, you got some real problems.
That's a
Bill,
nickel and platinum groups, metal city. They're going to have their jobs.
Well, I'm glad to
have
see
one
that kind of
quick
conflict between, hold on a second, Mary.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm really impressed with the fact that you were able to dialogue back and forth between the two of you. But for now, the presentation, this session is done. And if people would like to stay a little bit longer, have further comment, whatever is in their mind,